Okay, welcome to paint. Paint in its most basic form is any kind of like powdered pigment made with either minerals from the earth or chemical pigments suspended in sort of a viscous or liquidy or gel-like binder that makes it brush and smooth along, okay? We're going to talk about types of paints. The first one, which is its own separate category, is called encaustic. Think of it as basically painting with melted candle wax. And you have to use a very stiff backing for this because it's so heavy. Naturally, when the wax dries, it's quite stiff, just like candles are. And you can't wash out your brush. You just basically reheat your brush to liquefy that hardened wax and paint with it. This is a very old form of paint. This isn't actually an encaustic piece on wood from the year 100, and it's a funeral portrait of a young boy, a Fayum portrait. Okay. Any paint of any type that is painted thickly enough to leave a raised, textured surface, almost like frosting, is that type of paint treatment is called impasto. Okay, that's for any paint. These are some Van Goghs up close. You can see how thickly the paint has been applied to the canvas. There are two basic varieties of paints, water-based paints and oil-based paints. This slide is key. Water-based paints dry very fast. Oil-based paints dry very slow. Water-based paints have less rich color quality. They tend to look a little bit, less rich. They're not quite as beautiful. Where oil-based paints tend to be very rich in color, very luminous, very beautiful color quality. That's the type most artists, fine artists, still prefer to work with oil-based paints, even today. And water-based paints are worked, and wash your brushes out, you thin out the paint with water. Oil-based paints are worked and cleaned with flammable, toxic chemicals like acetone, mineral spirits, turpentine, and they're caustic to skin, they will burn you, they are flammable, okay? Just because they're water-based paints doesn't mean they're made of water. It means that they're just worked and cleaned with water and have these characteristics in common. All right, so let's take a look at some water-based paints. Tempera is a water-based paint. This is a tempera by Botticelli, The Birth of Venus. The binder in tempera paint is egg yolk, believe it or not. You pierce the egg yolk and you use just the yellow yolk and you add your pigment to that and paint with that, but you wash and clean your brushes with water. Fresco is another water-based paint. Think of this as working in plaster. If you've ever been to the Home Depot and you go to the building materials area, you pick up a big old 40, 50-pound bag of calcium carbonate. It's a white powder. And you pour some water in a bucket with that powder and you mix it. It usually hardens. It takes a chemical process when the water hits it. And it hardens in about 2 to 3 minutes to like rock hard. And they use it for building, for like setting posts and spackling walls and things like that. Fresco is painting with wet plaster. It's very durable. And once you've painted on a wall, especially with fresco paint, with true fresco, it's literally set in stone. This is an example of Michelangelo's frescoes, one of them in the Sistine Chapel on the ceiling. And if you ever make a mistake, you basically have to wait for it to dry, chisel it all out, and start all over again. You paint basically wet with wet plaster paints onto a wet plastered wall. And so it solidifies it totally. That makes it very difficult to make changes. This Diego Rivera fresco is called fresco secco. This is where you basically just paint with fresco paints on a dry, unprepared wall. Okay. Watercolor and gouache are two water-based paints. Watercolor is the only paint, this is going to be difficult to understand. Usually to lighten and darken paints, you either add black or white, you know, that basic idea. But watercolor is the only one where you don't use your tube of white watercolor paint. You throw that one out. You use the white of the paper by thinning the paint to make it lighter. Gouache works the same sort of way. Gouache is sort of just a thicker, more opaque watercolor. Here's an example of a watercolor. Notice how detailed this young hair piece is. And this is a watercolor. Notice how different it looks. It's very transparent. That's usually a hallmark of a really great watercolor. So you really want to be able to see that paper kind of through it. And it needs to look not overworked. That's what makes watercolor a little bit difficult for a lot of artists to manage because there are no changes. You can't make it different really. Once you've hit it once, it's over. Sort of a one-time shot at the painting, okay? Acrylic paint is a water-based paint. It's basically painting with sort of a acrylic polymer. And it does tend to have sort of a plasticky look to it. It dries very fast. It's used most often in colleges and universities these days for painting classes, like you would use regular oil paints, but except this is acrylics. They tend to have less beautiful color quality. And another problem with acrylic paints is that they dry a different color. From when they're dry, they're a different color than they are when they were wet, which makes it really hard to match. They also, since they dry so quickly, it's very difficult to get them to blend very easily. You can't really work that paint and make smooth blends because it dries so quickly. This is a Shimamura. He chose acrylic on purpose because he wanted his work to look like flat comic book kind of renderings. And that's why he chose acrylic paint. Acrylics are very useful if you want a fast drying paint. Here's a gouache by Jacob Lawrence. Again, big, flat, bold areas of color, hallmark of a water-based paint. Oil-based paints. The first type is oils. These weren't invented until about the 1500s, and they're based on sort of a linseed, something like the sap of a tree, think of, is their binder. But the color quality in oil-based paints is beyond excellent. Very rich, very beautiful, almost transparent in some areas on the canvas. It makes them seem even more alive, if you can call it that, with color quality. This is a Monet. It's an oil painting. Look how beautiful the color is. Enamels are another type of oil-based paints. If you've ever painted your nails and had to use fingernail polish to remove the paint, you have just painted with an enamel paint. They tend to be very shiny and decorative, have rich quality of color, and this is an oil enamel piece here from China. Spray paint is an oil-based paint. Believe it or not, spray paint is considered to be one of the oldest forms of paint there was. Back in the prehistoric time with the cavemen, they considered when they used a tube and sprayed like different types of charcoals or ochres or things like that onto walls, that was considered spray paint, even though it wasn't the same kind of thing that we use today. Think of this as literally the kind of stuff that graffiti artists use. This is an early graffiti artist called John Matos, and this is a sample of his work in spray paint. If you work with spray paints, you often have to wear, well, you almost always have to wear a sort of a gas mask because the chemicals are so brain destructive to the brain.